Have you ever wondered what secrets might be hiding inside the walls of your own home? I mean, usually it's nothing exciting, maybe some old wiring, some insulation, but for a few unlucky families in Ukraine, that secret was silent, invisible, and absolutely lethal. This is the incredible and tragic story of the radioactive apartment of Kramatorsk.
I mean, just think about that for a second. It's a terrifying thought, isn't it? The one place you're supposed to be safe is actually the very thing making you sick. Well, for the residents of apartment 85 on Gvardates of Kantamirevsa Street, this wasn't just some hypothetical question. It was a real-life, 9-year nightmare.
All right, let's dive into the story. It really kicks off in 1989. A new family moves into this apartment in Kramatorsk, excited for their new home. But pretty soon, their young child gets gravely ill. And they just knew something was terribly wrong here, something more than just bad luck. So they pushed, and they pushed for an investigation. And what the officials found? It was beyond anyone's worst fears.
So investigators brought in a Geiger counter, and the readings just went off the charts. Specifically, right there in the kid's bedroom, next to the bed, the dose rate was 1,800 roentgens a year. Now, to put that in perspective for you, that is hundreds, maybe even thousands of times higher than what's considered a safe background level. It was an exposure rate that pretty much guaranteed severe illness or even death. The family's fears were confirmed in the most horrifying way you can imagine.
And this is where the story gets really strange. The radiation wasn't coming from a nearby power plant, and it wasn't from a big disaster like Chernobyl. The danger was literally part of the building. It was coming from inside a single concrete panel in the wall between two apartments. So the big question was, how on earth could something so deadly end up sealed inside a family's home?
To get that answer, investigators had to rewind the clock by about a decade. You see, the whole story starts not with some evil plan, but with a simple yet catastrophic mistake that created what's known in the industry as an orphaned radioactive source.
So what was this thing? Well, the culprit was a tiny capsule of something called cesium-137. It's a really common byproduct from nuclear reactors. And because it emits this super steady, predictable amount of gamma radiation, it's actually really useful for stuff like industrial gauges, devices that measure how full a giant container is, and even in radiation therapy for medicine.
A really good way to picture this capsule is to think of it like a tiny, silent battery. But instead of electricity, it's pumping out deadly radiation. And with a half-life of around 30 years, it's a battery that just keeps going and going and going, silently poisoning everything around it.
So how in the world did it get lost? The chain of events was shockingly simple. This little capsule was part of a level gauge at a quarry nearby. At some point back in the late 70s, the gauge probably got damaged or just lost. The tiny capsule, seriously no bigger than a pen cap, fell out. It was just lost in tons and tons of gravel. And then, that exact same gravel was scooped up and used to make the concrete for a new apartment building going up in Kramatorsk.
And that simple mistake, it kicked off a silent tragedy that would unfold over the next 9 years. All because that one little lost capsule got mixed into one single concrete panel.
The timeline of what happened in that apartment is, well, it's just devastating to read. The first family moves in 1980. Just 1 year later, their 18-year-old daughter dies of leukemia. The very next year, her brother dies from the same thing, and then their mother passes away not long after. The apartment actually sat empty for a while. Then, a new family moves in around 1987. It was only when their son also developed leukemia that his father, who just had a gut feeling something was deeply wrong with the apartment itself, finally pushed for the investigation that blew the whole thing open.
You have to understand, for years, this was a complete medical mystery. The residents were showing all the classic signs of radiation sickness. They were tired all the time, they had dangerously high white blood cell counts, and eventually leukemia. But because nobody could even imagine the source, doctors just blamed it on everything else. Must be bad genetics, hereditary conditions, or just tragic, awful, unexplainable bad luck. The enemy was totally invisible. And that feeling of complete helplessness, it's just perfectly captured by what a member of one of the families said. It was something like, "We never understood. We just thought our family was unlucky." Can you imagine? They were living, sleeping just feet away from a lethal radioactive source, and they had absolutely no idea. Okay, so let's jump back to 1989. The source has been found, but now officials have a brand new problem. how do you safely remove a highly radioactive object from the middle of a concrete wall in a building that people are living in? It was going to take a very precise and very dangerous operation. The plan they came up with had to be meticulous. First, they pinpointed the capsule's exact spot. Then, they got all the residents in the adjoining apartments out of there. Now, instead of just smashing the wall from the inside, they decided to drill in from the neighboring apartment, which was less contaminated. A section of that concrete panel was carefully cut out, and the piece with the capsule inside was removed and immediately sealed in a special lead-lined container to be taken away and disposed of safely.
So, in the end, what was the human cost? The final tally is just heartbreaking. That one mistake, made a decade earlier, ultimately cost 6 people their lives, 4 children and 2 adults. And beyond that, at least 17 other people, from residents to the original construction workers, were documented as having received significant harmful doses of radiation, all from one tiny lost capsule.
You know, the Kramatorsk incident is such a stark reminder of a hidden danger. There are thousands of these industrial and medical radioactive sources in use all over the world, every single day. In the story of this one apartment, it forces us to ask a really critical question. What systems do we have to track these things from cradle to grave? And how can we be absolutely sure that a simple mistake never lets one of these things become orphaned and embedded in the heart of a community ever again?